Want to remind you guys something. I don't know because I forgot what I was going to say. So I'm going to have to redo the intro again. Ugh. College football nerds here to talk Michigan and Penn State. Y'all, it's a light week in college football. A couple of interesting ones in the Pac-12, but not a whole lot of huge matchups. So we didn't do a bunch of previews this week. We did a couple of reviews this week. LSU and Florida, we talked about it in South Carolina and Georgia and what in the world happened in that game. We talk about that one as well. So obviously we also did a top 10. If you want to just kind of get some thoughts from us on what happened last week and where we're at in our top 10, those videos will be linked in the description. Obviously they'll be on our channel. I want to remind y'all, as we do every video, it helps us out a whole lot. If you like and subscribe, helps us out even more if you comment. So your comment homework for this week is simple. Just give us a score prediction of who do you think is going to win this game and back it up with data. Don't just say because you're a fan of the Nittany Lions they're going to win the game. Tell us why. All right, Josh, these two teams have had some struggles offensively. They look almost like mirror images of one another. One is undefeated, one is not. They have this really recent transitive property action going on with the Iowa being in the middle of this love triangle, and it was almost the same game played out for both of these teams. So if these teams are mirror images, do we stop the whole discussion with the fact that this game is going to be played at one of the toughest places to play in college football? Is that the end of it?
It's funny that you say they're mirror images because I'm sure a lot of Penn State fans are now up in arms because their total yardage and scoring stats are higher. But to your point, when they've played teams of similar competition level to the extent that they have, Penn State's looked a lot like Michigan has. That probably says a lot about how much competition makes you look a certain way. Now, Penn State has had a higher ceiling than Michigan. When they've been in games where they're playing weak opponents, they've blown them out a little better than Michigan in some of them, whereas Michigan struggled early against Middle Tennessee State and Army. We'll get in later about that and what that probably says about the RPO schemes Penn State's running versus the more zone read-based scheme, I think, right now you're seeing from Michigan. Answering your question, I think this being in Happy Valley really does have a big effect on the game because when you've got a defensive game and you've got two teams that are in major games looking like they're not going to score 20 points more often than not, negative plays tend to control. The team that gives up a big play on special teams, the team that throws the costly interception, tends to lose it. It really didn't give me a ton of confidence, if that's your analysis, that someone has Shea Patterson. Really doesn't give me a ton of confidence if they got Shea Patterson and you're playing in one of the louder, tougher stadiums in the country. I do think that's probably the biggest single edge in the game, but we can get into it a little further to say why these teams are mirror images of each other and why we think that's what it's coming down to.
Here's my concern. We talked early in the year, and I coming into the discussion, I was leaning Michigan. Then I thought about having to play this on the road in front of all those fans and how we've seen Shea Patterson in this offense fold up at home. But then I'm back to the fact that we were not loving the fact that this game, the Penn State played Pitt really close. That was a canary in the coal mine warning bell. I know it's rivalry game and all that, but 17-10 to Pitt, you got to beat them bigger than that. If you want to be a top 10 team, top 5 team, if you want your undefeated record when you ain't played nobody, Paul, to mean something, you got to beat the crap out of people. We were hard. We were really tough on Clemson for the same thing. And this schedule's been even lighter than Clemson so far. Iowa is not a great team. Really bad offense, pretty good defense. But look, you got a quarterback throwing under 5 yards an attempt. You got a running game that's like, I think it was like 3.3 yards per attempt. Those are bad numbers. Those are real bad numbers. And look, Michigan, they only scored 10 points against Iowa too, but give me a reason why I should kind of swing my vote to Penn State other than KJ Hamler. Because right now, if I'm looking at this Penn State team, that's really the only thing I like about them. offensively.
I think you've got a point to something that's going right for Penn State. It's that they can run the ball. They can complete throws down the field. I mean, you already so both of us feel like KJ Hamler is the one thing that we really like in the Penn State offense. Not shocking. He's leading the team in receiving yards by a ton. But I'll say this. I think Penn State's defense has been opportunistic. They've been a little more aggressive. Defensively in that game, it really stuck out that they couldn't block Windsor. I mean, Iowa could not block Windsor. The front has been a force all year, but in those big games, your best pass rushers stand out. I think Penn State is an underrated team in terms of athleticism. The back seven, their guys got their heads turned around really well. They gave up a late touchdown pass where Iowa, the receiver goes up and takes the ball over the guy's head, but he's turned around. He's looking for the ball. He's in position to make an interception. Really, it's not that hard to do when Nate Stanley can't hit the broadside of a barn, but they're in position. Now, Michigan has had glitches. I mean, they got kind of crushed by Wisconsin, where Wisconsin was running the ball all over them and could do whatever they wanted to do. I have more faith right now in Penn State's defense than I have Michigan's defense to not have some issues. I have more faith that when Shea Patterson does something stupid, it's going to turn into a negative play, whereas I think given pressure, Clifford will do something stupid, but I'm not sure that Michigan is quite as adept at creating that pressure, nor as adept at capitalizing over it.
I'm a little concerned about the Penn State running game. And Penn State and Michigan fans are going to take this video, this observation, or these observations we have as negative. They're really not. We're trying to find out weaknesses, since we do think these teams are so close to one another. We're trying to find out the weaknesses for the other side, where there's going to be an advantage. And look, I'm admittedly being a little more negative on Penn State because I've sort of taken the Michigan side, and they're a 7.5 point underdog, which is a lot. That's a lot for this game. Even if I ended up picking Penn State, I can't see Vegas saying, and this is what really scares me, and I'm kind of talking through this as I say this. Vegas is saying 7.5. That's a lot. That's saying something that I don't know. And so I don't know what it is. But Penn State versus Pitt, you take away one 85-yard run, and I know it's easy. You take away the best play of the game for them, it's going to look bad. You take away one 85-yard run, they had 2.5 yards of carry in that game on 29 carries. That's not good. That's just not good. So I'm concerned because this Michigan defense is sort of set up to do well against the type of offense that Penn State's going to put out there. And I also, in the back of my mind, know that just pure recruiting rankings, have seen flashes, that there's something in there in this Michigan offense. If we're talking, or maybe prove me wrong, or at least disagree with me, or read me. What do you think about this? Michigan has not had a good offense this year, but based on the potential, they have a higher potential to do something explosive against a good defense than Penn State has shown this year.
I tend to agree with you a little bit when you talk about Michigan versus Penn State in the receiving core. I think Michigan's receiving core is a little more balanced, which is kind of an interesting thing. So Penn State, I think a lot of their struggles, let's back up a step, come from the fact that you've got at the receiving position for Penn State, 275-pound receivers leading the team in receiving. You got KJ Hamler and Dotson. They're both, sub 6 foot, 175-pound guys. Then you got Furmouth, Bauer, shorter, who's effectively a tight end at 6'4", like 235. That are the next three leading receivers, then a running back, then another running back, and then you're all the way down to Daniel George, who has 4 receptions in the season. This is a team that is predicated on small guys in the RPO scheme that are fast and quick and able to make explosive plays, tight ends to move the sticks a little bit underneath, and not a whole lot else in terms of downfield receiving threats in a true pattern. Michigan has, I think, the potential for more downfield explosive plays because Collins, Peoples-Jones, and Black are better prototypical receivers. Collins, I think, is their best all-around receiver. The other two are good. Black has never, he was banged up early, and I think he's just never turned it around. they are the, more like the 6'1", 220 kind of mold that you want to have at the receiving position. And I think that lets them be more dynamic with their offense, whereas Penn State can score quick with their small guys, but it's hard to have lots of explosive plays throwing downfield because they're at a significant height disadvantage on jump balls. Given the fact that Michigan does have a more dynamic quarterback, now we're well on the record doing a preseason video before he even started at Michigan, which we took flack for and then got credit for saying he's a very inconsistent passer. Patterson can spin a football, and he can throw downfield. That makes me think Michigan should be able to get some big explosive plays. But again, you got a 7.5-point line. Trying to unpack that a little bit, my skepticism would be maybe there's something to be said that people are going to want to put money on Penn State, that Penn State has been the better team, that there's a lot of negative perception around Michigan. I think when you look at the big games, I'm not sure how founded that is. But again, Penn State's lack of balance at receiver may not really matter because I'm not sure, given what they've had at production in the quarterback position, that a traditional downfield passing game might even be that effective. I think maybe this line has to do with the fact that this is a very low-scoring game otherwise, where neither team is probably going to run the ball that great. I mean, Charbonnet looked like he was doing well some ways against Iowa, but he finishes at 3.2 yards per carry. I think maybe the thought here is those quick, fast, speedy guys from Penn State can get mismatches on Michigan like we've seen in recent years, exploit where Dan Brown's defense sometimes doesn't quite compensate for the RPO, and that kind of aggressive scheme, and that maybe they get a couple, you can call them cheap scores, but it's the same conversation you hear with other teams like Auburn. They're not cheap. It's a function of the offense when you're running an RPO scheme, when you're running a heavy spread scheme, which Penn State is slowly transitioning to, that maybe they get a couple touchdowns that way. And maybe this is a low enough scoring game where 2 touchdowns to those small receivers, they make a man miss, or they dart and a safety's bites on a play action and they get behind them. Maybe that's where the touchdowns are. Because when you look at the passing game components, Michigan does look better equipped than Penn State. Of course, balanced by the fact that the offensive lines are not equally equipped. But it is definitely an interesting point you bring up. And it's a little hard to place.
If I'm putting something on the Penn State side of the ledger, I don't think Penn State versus Illinois is a tight game in the fourth quarter. That's not a hard data point of any kind. It's more of a eye test. Give me a feel for this game. And maybe they were planning ahead. Maybe they were caught napping. But it's 28-25 in the fourth quarter. Really? They ended up 42-25. But come on. Illinois, you got to beat them 50-0. Come on. So that scares me a little bit when I'm thinking, okay, between these two teams, who's shown that they can give up some points? Yes, Michigan technically had a better outing versus Illinois or versus Iowa in their transitive property game, but we've had 30 burger, whatever it was that Wisconsin put up on them, and then 25 from Illinois, and that's not 25 garbage points. That's 25-28 in the fourth quarter. So that to me is making me a little concerned if I'm a Michigan fan that Penn State might be able to put some points up, and they've got the defense to stop Michigan from scoring on their end of the book. So we can talk about that all day. Let's get into our computer model. You can maybe give them a quick refresher on what it is and get into it, and let's see if the computer model is saying Vegas is crazy.
So our computer model. Quick touch point, if you followed our show in the past, that both these teams have been on our model many a time. It's designed to give us a baseline. And the way it works is by taking per play stats. We don't use total yardage because teams run different numbers of plays, and there's all kinds of other factors that brings into the game. We want to know how you're operating in a per play sense versus the teams you played, and how those teams did versus their opponents. Again, you have to do per play because of tempo in particular. And then we, based off how you did against them, how they did against everybody else, we build an idea of what your team looks like holistically. We get a prediction of the kind of yardage and the kind of game we're likely to get when you play each other. And then we look at your past history this season, say, how did you do in against the teams you played? what were the stats like in those games, and how did it reflect your final scoring? What were all the different factors there? Not in just like a points per play regard, but more in a sort of game profile sense, where we build more of a curve, guessing how your scoring changes depending on how the game flow works in a particular game. Because a lot of teams, and we had this example with Georgia, they had decent per play yardage, couldn't score points in their loss to South Carolina, and it's because their style of offense requires a high yard per play to be successful. And when they drop below 6 yards per play, they start to shut down because they're so dependent on the run. Spread offenses can be a lot more effective with lower yardage. In this game, it shouldn't shock anybody that they're two good defenses, okay? So one of the intermediary statistics that we generate is something called percentages allowed, or opponent percentages allowed. The idea being, if your opponents average 8 yards per carry and you allow 6, you're allowing 75% of their average. Personally, we feel like this is probably a simple statistic that ought to be used, and for some reason it's not, because it's a better idea of how your run defense is done relative to your competition in a pretty simple form. Michigan's allowing 73% of opponent rushing, 88% of opponent passing. Penn State's allowing 47% of rushing, 92% of passing. Those run numbers are both elite. Now, 47% of rush totals is a stupid low number. So low that I kind of had to do a double take and relook at it. Personally, I think there's probably a lot of deception to it. One example from there is Maryland is actually averaging almost 5.4 yards per carry. They are not doing that consistently. They've been super up and down. It's inflating the opponent totals, so the average looks better for Penn State because their opponents look better than they should. But still, Penn State's allowing 1.8. Michigan's allowing right under 3. And we say a lot of times, once you get under 3 yard per carry allowed, it's kind of hard to differentiate because, whether they get 2 yard per carry or whether they get 3 yard per carry, who the heck cares? And a lot of times it just depends on whether or not the other team's falling forward. Not often a great reflection of a lot, even though 73 to 47, whatever, big gap, both elite numbers, both means you're going to pretty well shut down the run against most teams. I think the more interesting point there is that 88% pass defense from Michigan, 92% from Penn State. We frequently point out 95% is really, average. And the reason for that being, everybody plays some weak out of conference teams that inflates everybody's passing stats. You should hold them below their, quote, average on the season to be a true average defense from a P5 level. Pass defense is a lot harder to get low than run. And there's a reason why pass teams are the teams that do well in the playoff. The reason the pass dominates the NFL. We see it now for 4 years, week in and week out in our model. Nobody holds you to a particularly low pass defense stat. If you're holding somebody to 75% in pass D, you're an awesome pass defense. Whereas a rush D frequently we'll see can be 40, 50% range in the college game. But 92% from Penn State is actually just average or above average. The truth is, the passing offenses they've faced have not been very good. The best was a Purdue team that isn't particularly good, and the rest of them are 6.2, 6.1, 6, 7.2 yards per attempt. Not good passing offenses. And 7.5 is our mark really for competency in passing offenses. So they placed one in Purdue that we would even call competent and not particularly good. 88% for Michigan is not all that different, and it's for the same reason. Both these teams are holding their opponents to 6.1 yards per attempt, but both these teams are playing several teams. In Penn State's case, 3 teams that are averaging about 6.1 yards per attempt. And Michigan as well, Rutgers and Illinois are averaging about that mark. Middle Tennessee State and Army are averaging about 7. Now, Army's triple option, so that's kind of its own thing, not really reflective of their overall stats. And Wisconsin was the one exception, but Wisconsin moved the ball pretty darn well against Michigan. So, maybe these passing defenses are not quite as good as people would suspect. It may actually be more their performance may be more the result of opponent defenses not being so great. At least that's what our model is suggesting with the numbers. Actually turning to the full score, which is the point of why everybody wants to hear with this. Michigan is expected to get about 2 yards a carry and 7 yards per attempt. That's not great. 4.3 yards per play. Penn State, equally not great, but a little better. 3 yards per carry, 7.9 yards per attempt. Again, 7.5 is our mark for competency. So Penn State, we usually say 4.5 runs, 7.5 pass. Penn State's not quite competent on the run, but at least 3 is enough to keep you honest. Sub 2 is not. 7.9 yards per attempt means they are actually throwing the ball okay for a 4.3 to 5.4 projected yardage per play differential in Penn State's favor. Looking at past results, what does that result in scoring? Well, Penn State 23, Michigan 14. That's a low-scoring game, 9-point margin. We don't factor in Vegas at all, to be clear, really, with our picks. We don't factor Vegas at all in any way with our model, but 9-point margin of victory for Penn State, pretty darn close to that 7.5-point line.
Yeah, and look, I think Vegas, they do a better job at this than we do. Otherwise, we'd be making a ton of money. I really struggle with this because for every point that I see on the Michigan side that's negative, I see a counterpoint on the Penn State side. Look, I think 17-10 to Pitt, if they were playing a real good team that weekend, if they were playing Wisconsin that weekend, that had a similar result. You play like that against Wisconsin, you're going to get beat like Michigan got beat. But I also look at like Army. This is not the same Army team that we had last year. That was actually pretty good. I was all ready to go Michigan until I really looked at that Illinois game. You see a score like 42-25, and you think, okay, it was 42-13 in the fourth quarter. Scrubs gave up a little bit, but that's not what we had. And a team that can allow that to happen going into face, even if it is a mirror image, it's just a tough place to play. I mean, even teams that are far better than Penn State having to play there when it's a big game struggle. I think Michigan's going to struggle. So I'm going to go ahead and give my score. I think then you can give me yours. Give me Penn State 23, Michigan 13. Let me know what you got.
I've got Penn State 24, Michigan 13. Both of us just rocking 1 point off from the model's prediction. Look, we say this all the time. If we're predicting a game to be below 25 points on either side, anything can happen because the scoring is so low that random events can completely alter the result. You saw that with South Carolina, Georgia, really. That South Carolina was not winning that game, couldn't score in the second half, and they held on because it was low enough scoring that they got the negative plays that they needed to at the right moment to keep Georgia from scoring enough to take the lead in that game. But at the end of the day, it's hard for me to see Michigan scoring, and I have 13 just because I could see them getting a couple of field goals where they get a big chunk play on offense, don't quite score, and then back up 5 yards and kick a field goal. And Penn State, 24 points. Also not a ton. I'm just thinking, maybe they get enough, maybe in a worn out defense from Michigan. I think that 7.5 point line, if down to it were right, if you asked me to pick a game, if I had the choice, I wouldn't be picking this one. I think it's too low scoring. I think it's too volatile. But I don't, given the hostile crowd, given the issues Michigan had, given the fact they couldn't put away Illinois, and given the fact that they struggled defensively in the Wisconsin game. And I think that's the biggest point is Penn State, even in their bad games, has looked really good on defense. Michigan did have a game where they did not look great on defense. And they've struggled a little bit in a couple games, at least off and on. That makes me think Penn State can actually score some. I don't have much reason to think Michigan will. It's still frustrating because there's no good reason for it. At least they showed some pop in the Illinois game. I'll say that. Their offense looked functional a couple times. Looked like maybe they're getting things to click. This offense should be way better than it is. There's a reason we had them so much higher rated coming into the season, and they're just not there, but they're not there. And I think Penn State's defense is, and that's why I have Penn State in a low-scoring game.
But we also flagged in the preseason why they're not there. We didn't think it was going to be as big of a problem as it is, but we flagged in the preseason, and Michigan fans are tired of hearing this from us, but we said, you're Michigan, you need to go and get an offensive coordinator because your offense is struggling. You don't go and hire a guy that's never called plays before. You don't go and hire a guy who's a good wide receiver coach, a good recruiter, and has some game planning experience to actually call the plays. It's a completely different thing. It takes years of doing that at a low to medium level of football till you get a really good feel on what to do. And that little bit of difference is the difference in having explosive offense and not. Having said that, in your opinion, if we wake up Sunday morning and the newspaper that nobody's reading because everybody gets their news online shows Michigan as the winner in this game, is it going to be because they found something in their passing game, some explosiveness in their passing game, or is it going to be something else?
I think it's going to be something else. And I alluded to this earlier. I think Penn State's back seven is underrated in how athletic they are. They're good. They're fast, and they play the ball well. They've got a live pass rush. This does not seem like the game where if you're Michigan that you're going to turn it on. If you generate some points, I don't think it's going to really be that you found something. It's that you made a couple big plays. Because I don't think you're going to, even a really good team, I don't think is going to really throw it around the yard on Penn State. I don't care what the model says and the percentages allowed. That's what my eyeballs are telling me. So I think if Michigan to pull out the win here, what we need to see is a similar game. And this is what scares me with Penn State. I mean, Clifford had a miserable game throwing the football against Iowa. And he made some throws that were just kind of off the mark. And he's a gritty guy that can be a tough runner. But he seems to sit and process things way too long. He takes sacks. I'm not sold on Clifford against a high-level team. And I think that's why the production has been so up and down for him. I think if Michigan wins this game, it's going to likely because of mistakes in the passing game from Penn State more than good plays from Michigan. And I'm not trying to be overly negative, but in comparing the two teams and their particular strengths and weaknesses, I think that's more a decision point that could go in Michigan's favor. Not that I necessarily think it will.
All right, y'all, that's going to be it for our Penn State and Michigan preview. Michigan's fans are a little more used to us and know that we can come across negative, and we apologize for that. Penn State fans know we don't hate your team. We are not homers. We're not super Michigan fans. We're not here to crush you. If we sounded negative, it's because you're being on the cusp of being viewed as that elite-ish team. So we're going to poke holes where we can, just like we poked holes in LSU earlier tonight, just like we've done the same thing with Alabama this year, just like Clemson fans really hate us right now for doing the same thing. So we don't hate your team. We just had to get that out there. And we love mixing it up with Penn State fans in the comments on the boards. Same thing for Michigan. Y'all let us know what the score is going to be. We'll talk about it in the comments, and y'all can even tell us if you're okay or not okay with how negative we came across in this one. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.